So hello and welcome to the Potted RV. Today is going to be a bit of a different video. One of the things I wanted to sit down and explain, because I know a lot of people find this kind of confusing, is the differences between climates and growing zones. Now in the US, we have a USDA growing zone. The Department of Agriculture has the entire country broken down in different growing zones. Those growing zones cover the area's median low temperature. So what the temperature on average drops down to. So you'll see a lot of different places that have the same growing zone, but they're in drastically different parts of the country. That doesn't mean they have the same climate. In fact, they don't. Most of the time they don't. A good example is here recently I've lived in two different places that had the exact same growing zone but drastically different climates. Tucson, Arizona, I lived there for 8 years. Their growing zone is 9B. Victoria, Texas, where I just moved away from, is also 9B. But they're drastically different climates. They have the average low temperature, year-round low temperature, where it drops the lowest of the year, is on average about the same. But it's different times of the year. Victoria's average last frost date is in end of January. It's like January 21st. Whereas Tucson's last frost date is typically on Valentine's Day. So very drastic times, different times of when you start. So it can be really kind of confusing, especially to a new gardener. A good example is growing zone wise. The gentleman that runs Grow Veg, which is, he's in England, I believe England. He's similar growing zone to the US's 8A, 7B, 8A, which is what I'm in. But he has a drastically different climate. It's a much wetter climate than here. The same thing with Meg from, I think her channel is Meg Grows or something like that. She's one of Epic Gardening's gardeners. She's in South Carolina, and she's also in, I think she's 8A, which is a very similar growing zone to where I'm at, because I'm technically on the border of 8A and 7B. So with the drastic differences in climate, where do you start? Well, you want to know what your growing zone is, because that tells you what your average low temperature, the lowest you're going to get. And that does matter, especially with frost tender plants and trees. Trees in particular, a lot of trees need to have a specific chill hours. So your growing zone does tend to have a baseline and what your chill hours can be. So if it's hardy in a certain grow zone, it typically will be hardy no matter where. Like, you can still have the same trees growing, fruit trees wise, growing in Tucson that you can have in Victoria. But Victoria has a much wetter climate. It's a lot closer to the ocean, but it is in general a much wetter climate. It's actually borderline tropical, subtropical. It's not quite enough rain to classify it as, sorry, the wind is driving me crazy. It's not quite enough rain to classify it as tropical, but it's close. It's a very humid climate. A lot of things that will grow in the tropics will definitely grow in Victoria, and they will also grow in Tucson. But in Tucson, you have to handle it differently. In Tucson, you have to manage water so much more carefully than you do in other places. Water retention in all of my planted, especially my potted plants, so much more intense. Making sure I kept water in that location as long as I could. And it actually has thrown me off here, because here there's a lot more water available to my plants. It rains a lot more. It does have a semi-dry season. This is technically arid subtropical, and I'm in 8A, 7B, 8A. It's technically borderline, and by looking over the temperatures, I would say it's 8A in all honesty, but its last frost date is oftentimes right there by Mother's Day. So frost tender plants I typically can't put out until right there at or just after Mother's Day. But when I go to look at other gardeners who's in similar growing zone as me, they're putting them out much, much earlier. So just because you're seeing a YouTuber who says their grow zone is the same as yours doesn't mean you can follow. The wind blew my door open. You can follow the same planting dates that they are. You really, really do want to check your frost dates, and you do need to pay attention to your actual climate. Tucson obviously is a desert climate, whereas Victoria is borderline tropical, but it's listed as subtropics. I'm technically, where I'm at here in Oklahoma, is considered a arid subtropical. It's a little bit drier than a lot of areas that are considered tropical or subtropical, but it's still on the borderline of being subtropical. So it's technically kind of a unique climate, actually. It's been an interesting little journey for me. One it's not since I was a little kid growing in Colorado have I had to wait that long to put plants out that are frost tender. And that's okay. But I sat there and thought about it. A lot of times, one of the biggest questions I had, especially when I was helping new people with their gardens in Tucson, was how do I know when to plant what? And you have to keep in mind that your frost dates aren't going to be indicative of what your high temperatures are. And your growing zones, when you look at the USDA growing zones, they don't cover high temperatures. A good example of that is Victoria, Texas, which is the same growing zone as Tucson, Arizona, doesn't get as hot. It does still get in the 110s, but one, nowhere near as long, and two, it isn't as hot. I mean, Tucson can reach 120 degrees and sit there for a couple weeks, whereas Victoria doesn't usually hit 120 degrees. It can once in a blue moon, it does, but it doesn't sit there, and it doesn't stay in the high 110s for 5 months out of the year, whereas Tucson does. Ooh, this is going to be a fun one. That's kind of entertaining to me, but I can't do anything about the wind, so we're just going to work our way through it. So hopefully the wind pushes it hard enough to shut it, because I don't have the physical strength to shut that door correctly. My husband has to. It's actually not a physical strength issue. It's the fact of how high it sits. The step well sits off the ground. That's almost 2 feet. It's almost as tall as my son. It's a little bit shorter. He is able to climb up it on his own, and so can the dog. But it is high enough that I can't angle right and push the door shut hard enough to keep it shut. So that's the issue I'm having with the door and the wind. But once in a while, the wind's strong enough to blow it shut and keep it shut. You want to pay attention to both your average rainfalls. They matter. They matter more than a lot of people think. You also want to keep attention to your average temperatures. Both your low temperature and your high temperature. They both matter, and they're both important. Your low temperature dictates when you can finally put frost tender things out, but your high temperatures, when your temperatures really start to climb, matters as to what you can put out. Because a good example is I can grow roselle here, but from everything I've read, I'd have to grow it as an annual. and I'm not going to get a lot of harvest out of it because it's not going to stay warm enough long enough for me to get a decent harvest out of it. It will still bloom, just like, I think, yeah, it's over here, just like this hibiscus, because Roselle is a hibiscus, and just like this hibiscus right here, it will still bloom. It's just not going to continually bloom like it would, say, in Victoria or Tucson, or even down in Florida, where it has a long blooming season. I just don't have the length of heat days that Roselle is going to really, really want. It's also the reason why okra is one that I only have a very short window that I can plant okra in, which I'm not going to plant it this year because I've already passed that window. Because okra is it is a truly heat-loving plant. It wants the heat, and here it will crest over 100 degrees where I'm at in Oklahoma, but it doesn't stay there very long, and it very rarely crests over 103. So it doesn't really get that hot here. When it comes to, like, we're coming into summer soon. Middle of next month, we'll be hitting those nice summer days. So I've put a lot of my very heat-loving plants in this grow bag. And I have quite a few of them coming up, which is nice. But I'm still going to have a couple of more months of planting. I'm going to be able to do June and July before I have to start looking at, once I hit the end of August is when I will start looking at my fall, what I'm going to plant for fall. When I do those at the heat of the day are going to have to go under shade, which my RV does have an awning, and in some of my older videos you can see the awning is in need of repair. We have the replacement awning, but it takes 3 people to replace that, and it's dependent on when my brother-in-law has time. So that hasn't been replaced yet, and we're getting there. Now, I have to say, just because I am noticing it, I really do like this position of the camera, where you can actually see a good deal of my potted garden behind me and alongside here. So if you guys think this is a better position for me to have the camera when I do these kind of things, please let me know in the comments. I like it. I don't know. What do you guys think? Anyways, back to growing zones and climates. So I do believe that there's my dog. One of the neighbors has another dog, and she thinks she needs to talk to him. We're having issues. But I do believe, if I remember right, there's 11 or 12 growing zones in the United States. I think it ranges from 4 to 12. I can't remember. It's been a while. But your climates are a bit different. You have tropical, you have subtropical, you have arid. I believe there's mountainous, you have desert. You want to look into what your climate is too, because that does matter. And you also want to check your average rainfalls, because that's going to matter whether or not you need to plan for a very dry situation. Like in Tucson, the average rainfalls there was 13 inches a year. That 13 inches dropped in 2 months. It was very, very, from middle of July to the end of September. That's when typically that rain drops. Otherwise, you almost don't see any rain at all the rest of the year, because it's, in reality, only has 2 seasons. It has a wet season and a dry season, whereas most other places have 4. Tucson actually doesn't. It actually has 2. And those matter too. So you want to pay attention to both your average rainfalls, but when do you receive your rains? Do you receive them pretty sporadically, evenly throughout the year like most other places do? Or are you in a wet, dry season kind of situation? Because can grow a huge number of things, and it can be very, very expensive because of the water retention issues. So if you grow, a good example is in Tucson, if you grow like other people on YouTube suggest, where you heavy amounts of perlite, vermiculite, they talk about adding sand to break up and bit larger particles. If you do that in Tucson, you are going to spend a small fortune on water just to keep your plants alive. Not even happy, just alive. So, and I had mentioned it in a previous video that a lot of these beds, I'm learning that I can go back to using more perlite in those beds because I don't need to have the level of water retention that I used to. For years and years and years, I wanted to slow that drainage down. Still want the drainage there, but I do want it to slow down because I want the plants to be able to access it. If it drains too fast, they have no access to it. Which, when it comes to potted plants, you're still going to have that problem. You can't handle a potted plant the way you do an in-bed. In-beds are not going to go through water the way a potted plant will because of evaporation. A lot of pots, a huge number of pots that you can find at decent prices, they're dark colored. And if you remember back to basically elementary, grade school, primary school, what does dark colors and sun do? It heats. It gets a lot hotter, which is the reason why I've debated on getting white plant safe paint and painting a lot of my actual pots. I wouldn't be able to do that with the grow bag, obviously, but that heat is going to cause the water inside those pots to evaporate faster. So you do have to keep in mind of that. That's one of the reasons why you can't look at a potted garden the same way you do as an in-ground garden. As much as you need to know what the growing zone, the climate, and the average rainfall is, also what kind of garden do you have? Do you have a garden that is in the ground? If you do, and you have rainfalls like here, which I believe is over 30 inches of rain a year, and it's pretty evenly spread. It does have its drop real quick here, drop real quick there. It does. Most places do. But it is fairly evenly spread compared to Tucson. That in-ground, you're not going to have to slow water down. You're going to, obviously, because this soil is actually clay soil, which is kind of funny because this soil is clay, but it's mildly acidic. And it's because the bedrock underneath this area is granite. One of the ways you can kind of roughly decide whether or not you have acidic soil or alkaline soil is by your bedrock. If you know what your bedrock is, you'll get a good idea of what your soil acidity is going to be. The easy way to remember it is granite is almost always going to be acidic, or at least mildly acidic, and limestone is going to be alkaline. That was the big problem I had in Tucson, is I couldn't grow cucumbers in Tucson because they're really picky about acidity. As easy as they are to grow for most other people, the soil in Tucson is so alkaline that if I didn't put it in bags and keep control over the soil acidity, I couldn't grow them at all. It was one of those things that I'd grown them everywhere else for years, and it took me probably 4 years to figure out why I couldn't grow them in Tucson, because I could grow them everywhere else. And they're actually a pretty easy plant to grow. So paying attention to your soil acidity, paying attention to your bedrock, there's a huge number of things. And it makes it complicated, but when you break it down, it's fairly simple. You want to know what your rainfalls are. You want to know what your average lows and average high temperatures are. And then stop and think about, okay, my garden is either in ground, it's either in beds. In beds are kind of in between potted and in ground. You're still going to have to water them a bit more, but you're not going to have to water them like I do here. I, right now, most anybody else in the Oklahoma area that I'm in is watering their gardens probably every other day if they're in ground or in a bed. I'm doing it every day, at least once a day. And sometimes I have to, especially with the grow bag, because the whole bag is porous. I'm having to water it twice a day. And that's kind of standard procedure. So my not putting perlite in it has helped a little bit with water retention with my smaller ones. But my larger ones, it's causing the soil to compact. So I'm still having to water it just as much as I would have if I had put the perlite in it, but I'm having compaction issues. So I know it sounds more complicated than it really is. It when you sit down and explain it, it feels overwhelming, but it really truly, when you break it down, is fairly simple. And it's an easy way for someone who's like I was. There was only one person for the longest time on YouTube that did gardening in a similar zone to me and a similar climate. And when I reviewed Epic Gardening's seed company, Botanical Interest, I pointed out that that's one of the reasons I watched him, was because he was in a similar growing zone and climate. He was and wasn't. He did not get anywhere near as hot. He's not in a desert. He's semi-arid because San Diego is still pretty close to the ocean, so it receives more water than Tucson does. The one other person was, I think her name is Angela, and she's in Mesa, Arizona, which is a suburb of Phoenix. And I could follow her and just, okay, whatever she's planting, I need to wait 2 weeks, because her end date for her frost date was 2 weeks earlier than mine. However, her, because of how similar of a growing zone it was, I could go off of what she was planting pretty easily, because her high temperatures were slightly higher than mine rather than lower. So I could be pretty certain that I can plant whatever she's planting because it's going to handle it due to the heat. We have similar heat issues. So keep in mind when you're looking at YouTubers that have a similar grow zone, also pay attention to their average rainfalls. And I wish they said their average rainfalls a little more often, and their actual climates. Because yes, you have microclimates in, like, I have a different microclimate than 2 blocks away from me. That is true. But your overall climate matters too. And you do want to know what they are, because it gives you a very good estimation of what you can grow. Like in Tucson, it's very difficult to grow kiwi because of the lack of rain. But in Victoria, you can stick kiwi in the ground and it's happy. But when you look at it, they're same growing zones, but in Victoria, it's hard to get grapes to grow. Whereas in Tucson, grapes grow wild. I worked as a tourist. I worked in a tourist area for almost 4 years. And they grow wild. I used to stop the tour right there by wild grapes and share them with the tourists, so that they could see that just because it's a desert doesn't mean it's empty of life. It has a great deal of life. And I hope I've given some information in this. I don't want to constantly repeat, and I have a tendency to do that. Let me know what climates you have. I do know that some of my viewers are up towards the north, and I have a very small viewership, but I do know some of them are up towards the north because I've spoken to some of you guys, and obviously a couple of you are actually family members of mine. So like my grandmother regularly watches my videos, and she's actually in 5B, so she's technically, a lot of the stuff I'm putting out now, she needs to wait a month to put out. Is usually June that she can safely put out a certain thing. Especially she puts it out at my parents' house. My parents are up the side of a mountain, and that makes it a bit colder. So she has to wait a bit, and I'll actually be going down there to visit her in a couple of months, and I'll be bringing the strawberries that I have rooting for her and a few other plants that hopefully she can keep my mom from killing. I promise you, there really is no such thing as a brown thumb. It's a lack of skill, and with skill, anyone can learn it. Never ever be afraid to try, because the worst that can happen is you learn from it. Anyways, I hope you liked this video. If you did, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.